Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stall 7, Ultiro's AUDL podcast. This is Alex Rubin alongside Bryan Jones, bringing you everything you need to know about Championship Weekend coming up in just a few days. First, let's go over the divisional playoff finals. Really exciting set of games here. We had Carolina taking down Austin 22-20, New York beating DC 19-18, Colorado over Salt Lake 26-21, and Chicago over Minnesota 21-16. Bryan, first, how are you? It's been a week.
It's been great. I mean, I got to watch one of the best games I've ever seen live, and it was really exciting, and even got kind of nervous for me. So,
all right,
so fun with the New York and DC.
Yeah, we got to start with that game. Of course, it was Jack Williams who threw a game winner. Of course, it was Ben Yot who made a clutch play at the end. But we saw a better fight from DC than I think most people outside of the Breeze expected. So you were at this game on the call. Tell me what you thought.
Yeah, I told Daryl Stanley after the game that I thought that was like the first time I've really seen his defense be that good against this type of team. I mean, in the past, it's been a lot of what's felt like maybe New York mistakes, and maybe that's giving too little credit, but having the ability to come back out and have Jasper Tom get that block, have Rowan, he got an incredible block underneath on Oscar late in the game. They pushed all the right buttons late in the second half, and they got a little lucky. This was a 13-8 game, and it looked like New York was going to carry on through and be fine, where all of a sudden at the end of the half, New York with the disc, Saul Rushmeyer-Bailey gives up the disc, and then with a few seconds left, Jasper Tom is able to launch a last-second huck that goes over a couple bodies, and Musa Jah picks it off, and the game was immediately different. And from there, DC was able to bring it within one because they received right out of the third quarter, and then it got super tight. And all of a sudden, all of the swagger and confidence that was there for New York was kind of gone, and both teams traded until the very end, where all of a sudden we saw Jack Williams doing his thing and Ben Yot getting his first buzzer beater. You know, we talk about Ben Yot making clutch plays, but that's surprising that it's his first buzzer beater ever.
Yot's a D-line player, I mean.
Yeah, and maybe that's a mistake. And so there was a lot to look at moving forward here, because the DC team, even though they were down 13-8, in the first quarter, you could kind of see they were getting what they wanted out of this New York team. And they went pretty low on break chances to start off this game. I think it was something like 0 for 5. Yot threw a turnover right away in the first point of the game. The DC offense wasn't able to punch it in. And even at one point, they really had a chance, and I don't know if it was take the lead or tie it earlier, where Alan Kolick missed a really ambitious inside shot late that would have probably given them the lead. And so this DC defense from start to finish was pretty great. It was just their offense that picked it up and took advantage of it later on. And I think this means you got to start asking questions about this New York team.
That's super interesting. And now is not really the time that you want to start asking those questions. But I mean, you were there, I guess. To me, from the outside, unfortunately, you can't watch a replay of this game with the way the AUDL structured its Fox 2 Game of the Week deal. Did it feel more like New York was losing the game, or like DC was winning the game until, of course, New York ultimately won at the end?
It always felt like New York was winning the game. I mean, New York had the advantage from the opening point on. They were always leading or tied. So for DC, it just felt like they got all of a sudden this like lightning in a bottle, where they were able to go out, get close, rally the troops, and bring a lot of pressure after that, where everything became from the mode kind of changed from confidence to nervous, at least for me in the booth, looking at some of these guys. And from there, it just felt like New York's defensive game plan, while it worked pretty steadily, that it wasn't giving the right amount of pressure in crunch time. And so it's really interesting to kind of take a look at these games, because you can look at it from both sides. DC has a great game plan. I think they did. New York's defense was also pretty good throughout the entirety of the game. They converted in a lot of breaks early. They missed a critical chance when Marquez had a miscommunication with John Randolph in the end zone and threw one out the back. But it's the thing that's sticking with me is what they did to Ryan Oscar might be able to be copied by Carolina moving forward. And it's a question of, okay, what does New York do to adjust? They've made all these changes on their O-lines and D-lines throughout the year with the new players they've gotten. They moved Benyat to D. Do you move him back to O permanently for this game, or do you keep doing what you've been doing? I think it brings up a lot of questions because things just were not easy for New York all game long. They didn't really complete too many hucks. Oscar had 4 turnovers, who was the presumptive MVP until this very moment. And nothing just looked easy. So the New York offense is in definite need of an adjustment going into the next game. It's a question of how big is that adjustment? Can the players work through it? It was kind of a weird game because you're up 13-8. So it feels like, maybe these old possessions aren't as good as we want them to be, but we're up by 5 and we're about to blow the doors off of this one. And all of a sudden it gets close and you're just trying to survive. So I think it really sets the stage for a fantastic championship weekend because I think both of us felt like New York was this juggernaut. They looked great. They were crushing teams. They were playing with hunger. And now it looks like there's maybe a chink in the armor and that maybe somebody else can exploit that.
Yeah, that's exciting. I mean, I think there's, of the teams present at Championship Weekend, I think actually Carolina's in a pretty good place to replicate, what DC was able to do, given the versatile talent on their roster and the smart coaching. And not that Colorado and Chicago don't have that, but maybe not quite to the same extent that I think Raleigh just has this level of depth that isn't really matched in the league. But I think New York added depth this year and sort of addressed that deficiency from last season. And you want to talk about making adjustments, you pick your poison between Yacht and Randolph, Antoine Davis. Who do you move to offense if that's what you choose to do? I think New York has different levers that it can pull. And, on a day where, we say Ryan Osgar had an off day, he had 41 completions, almost 500 yards, 5 goals. It's not like he was shut down.
1 assist, though.
Yeah, of course.
You don't have to shut down a great player for it to matter. It's a matter of limiting him and making the other team work really hard. And that both teams, if you get a chance to watch the footage, both teams were gassed in the fourth quarter. DC did a good job of making it a slop fest. I mean, nobody looked like they had any energy by the end. And it was fortunate in some ways. I mean, overtime would have been super interesting if that buzzer beater doesn't go off. But yeah, it was interesting to see New York lose the initiative late in that third quarter and not really be able to gain it back.
That's an interesting way of putting it. I think you're right. You're never going to shut down the Stars, and your goal as a defense isn't necessarily to win the game that way, but to force the offense to play through its plans B and C and D and hope that once they're down to those levels that you have a bit of an advantage. I just think with the type and versatility of talent that New York has, their plan D is better than some teams' plan A. So I wouldn't worry too much if I was Empire, especially because I did come out. I mean, this is the best game the Empire faced all season, and they still won it. So it might be, a lot of times a team that's a juggernaut like that will say, "Oh, we needed a loss to reset our focus." The Empire going undefeated, not losing, like even their close games weren't that close during the regular season. I think their closest game was after opening night. It was like 3 points, maybe. So this might just be what the Empire team needed to kick into that final gear ahead of Championship Weekend.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think there's multiple ways of looking at this. For one, it's like from the media perspective, you're sitting there going, this team that was supposed to be the super team that was supposed to go ahead and just take all comers and dispatch them with relative ease now doesn't look as perfect as they once were. But you're right. I do think it's likely we got New York's one of their worst games, especially in the second half. To give up a 5-point lead like that, to not be able to generate defensive pressure. And the other thing is they've beaten DC twice. They've done it in comfortable margins. And now you're heading up against Carolina, which is the game you've been losing sleep over for the last year. Right? This is the team they want to go out and beat more than anything else after what happened to them in the championship game last year. And so I am of two minds of this. This may not matter whatsoever, and it may matter very greatly. And that's why we have to watch the game. the one thing that's really good is it adds that level of intrigue, like we talked about, that this is probably going to be a game with some believability that Carolina is going to pull it off. And I think that would be there anyway. But now it's even more believable. And that means there's a reason to tune in and watch this and see how it goes.
Yeah, like I think it's different. You're going to talk in a moment about Colorado and Chicago each winning their games by 5 points. I feel like if New York won this, 26-21, we're having a different conversation. I think the fact that DC was able to hold their offense to a lower score, the fact that DC was able to actually put a real scare in them and not like, oh, yeah, cute, they're close. Like a real, genuine DC probably wins this game if it goes to overtime. Just the way that, I know momentum may or may not be real, but it seems like the game was trending that way.
Last thing to shout out about this game, though, what was interesting in retrospect, and I wish we talked about it a little bit more, is that Daryl Stanley used almost all of his timeouts in an unorthodox way. So the first timeout he took at the game was in between points for his O-line in the first half to give them a rest and give them not a talking to is the wrong way, but telling them some adjustments that they needed to be made because New York was doing a good job on them early on. And then after that, I think another timeout was utilized in the fourth quarter. Marquez had a chance to send Empire up 3 and miscommunication with John Randolph. And that would have pretty much sealed the game. And Rowan wasn't out there on defense or on offense for DC. So Daryl on the ensuing possession took a timeout with the disc on the O-line already, just to give them a rest and be able to hold in that moment. Using those timeouts that way in unorthodox fashion is something you almost never see. You never see a timeout in between points, especially in the first half. It just doesn't happen. So I think there's got to be a lot of congratulations to Daryl on doing the right things, pushing the right buttons in this moment to get his team back in the game. And I think there's a little bit of luck involved, but even so, you saw Rowan crossing over, you saw them pulling out all the stops, and it almost was enough.
Yeah, Rowan leading the game in points played, 4 more points than anyone else, 18 on offense, 8 on defense. Comes away with 4 assists, 2 goals, and a block. Pretty good day in the office. And before we close the door on DC season, I'll give a shout out also to Tyler Monroe. His first season back with the team has 4 assists and 5 goals, just a single turnover on 27 completions and 450 total yards. Pretty solid day also. So let's move down. We'll talk about New York's semifinal opponent, the Carolina Flyers. They beat Austin 22-20. That sounds like it was a close game. Carolina was also up 13-8 at one point, just like New York, except they didn't blow the lead. They just kept it. Austin, chips away a little bit at it, finishes with a break. So it's ends up being a 2-point game in what really was probably closer to a 4 or 5 point game for Carolina. Good for Austin. I felt like they also, put up as good of a fight as they could in the second half. They dug themselves into a 6-3 hole. But it was another game where the best players came to play. Kyle Henke finishes with 5 assists, 2 goals, 3 blocks, played 32 points. That's a massive amount for a playoff game like this. 0 turnovers for Henke also on 31 completions and also nearly 500 yards.
He's grown a lot, hasn't he?
Yeah. And I think I'm curious how much of it is he's at the point in his professional career where he can be the focal point in the same way that he had been in his college careers at Texas Tech and then at Oklahoma Christian. I think on those stacked Roughnecks teams, he was never going to be the number one option, even if he was the best player. And on this Soul team, he's very much the center of attention and can dictate play. And he's also a pretty unique kind of player. He'll launch 50-yard hammers for fun and connect on them. I say for fun, but sometimes they're the best option. And I think he's just a tough cover in a sport that has a lot of them, but in he's not necessarily faster or a more accurate thrower, but the combination of skills that he has is just really unique in this game. So glad to see him really shine on a big stage.
Absolutely. I think in watching this game, it was just kind of clear that Carolina got the exact game they wanted from the get-go. There was no quick scores from Austin. They weren't shooting deep very much. They were forced to swing it back and forth over and over again. And by contrast, Carolina would get turnovers early and often and then would just completely give go their way to a slow, easy death, meaning that the Austin offense had to play a lot of defense that game, stay on the field for a long time. Points were very long early on. And it's one of those things where you try to think structurally about what's happening in a game. And in watching this, you're just seeing there's nothing that stands out from Austin that's, hey, this is so bad, or they can make some obvious improvements here. But it would just seem like they were having mistakes randomly. And I think that's because Carolina's defense is just so damn good all around. Like the amount of handler defenders they have, watching their switching, where it's like, great, you've done a give and go and you've gotten a switch. And now Mataraju and Seth Weaver are switched. Well, guess what? You still have an elite handler defender on you. And the downfield, they just didn't have a problem with containing Mark Evans or stopping any of their shooting power. It was just a lot of dump swing all game long, which seems to really completely favor Carolina. But the other thing that was remarkable about this is that in talking about the tail of the tape, I think you give credit to Carolina for getting the game they wanted, but Austin had chances. They got blocks. They had multiple chances throughout the entirety of the game to get back into it, but it was really Carolina's offensive D and Austin's inability to punch in breaks that made this not a game. And it's one of those illusions of control. When you go through a game and the other team doesn't hit on all of their break chances, but gets a lot of them, you walk away thinking you dominated the game. But Ultimate's a funny sport that when it's especially within two like that, that means there's two break chances that if Austin puts in, that this is a game more than anything else. And I'm sure that Carolina took their foot off the gas. It's pretty natural. But beneath that scoreline and beneath the score progression, Austin had chances. This is a team that can continue to get better in the offseason, maybe add a few pieces or just continue to grow. And with a little bit of this, a little bit of that, just applying it all around the right different places, get a little bit better in the handler space, a little better in the cutter space, everything. They could start to level up and really compete regularly against this Carolina team in a way where it doesn't feel like, oh, you're not there yet. We're just going to kind of hold your head underneath the water and, yeah, we'll take care of business and get out of here if you're Carolina.
Yeah, no, I think Austin definitely proved that, their appearance here wasn't a fluke, if you will. And that's encouraging, certainly for the team. I think you're right that they're missing a piece or maybe two, whether that's a player who they develop or a player who they bring in. I know Jake Radak had a fantastic season up until this point. It was really held in check, I feel like, in this game, but that was Carolina handler defenders. So maybe he's a player who we look for. I mean, it's hard to say improvement when you're completing 56 passes for 400 yards. It comes away with only one assist. I think as the quarterback of the team, you'd hopefully want a bigger game from him. But yeah, I think this Carolina team is just so hard to beat. I mean, the other factor we hadn't brought up yet, Anders Youngst comes away with 4 assists, 5 goals, no turnovers, just picked up right where he left off after, about 3 months away. I just think he's such an important piece for this Carolina offense. Partly as a release valve, partly as a red zone threat, but also allowing your Eric Taylors and your Elijah Longs to spend more time on defense and to really marshal that. Those are your 2 extra break chances there, is that the Flyers could put Eric Taylor out on defense because they didn't need him on offense. And that's not quite so simple, but
yeah, I love me some Durs. How can you not? He just fits right in. He's got a nose for the cone, knows how to get open in really small spaces, and then just incredibly fast after that. And it seems Carolina, they continue to just build out hybrids. Everybody's a hybrid. It's the one team that actually backs up the true hybrid talk, where they're like, there's a few people that are just being handlers, but the cycle they have is just brutal because you, as a defense, you can't key in on one individual because they'll cycle out and let other people come in. So you've got to play total team defense. And it is just rinse and repeat over and over again. I mean, you can call it a triangle offense. You can just watch them get to past half field and they will just dink and dunk their way around, no problem. Yeah. It was interesting the way also that Austin tried to game plan against that early. They tried a lot of roller pulls that led to no real advantage. I just didn't think that Austin got the game they wanted. Maybe they were trying to. I mean, they got turns, so maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. But Carolina just seemed comfortable moving it around over and over again, and willing to do that. And that just feels like their mode, which will be interesting to see if they stay that way going into this semifinal or the championship weekend or not.
Yeah, I mean, it really begs the question, right? We talk about, Carolina having, sort of growing over the course of the season, but really having this, peak game where they weren't really challenged, even though the score is close, even though, Austin had more blocks, even though they had the same amount of break chances, compared to a New York team that may have hit a low last week. So it'll be interesting to see how each one of them moves forward from that. Let's just go ahead and since we talked about the two division matchups, let's go into this Carolina New York matchup. We'll get to the Colorado Chicago after we talk about those games. It's really interesting, right? It's like strength versus strength here, in that Carolina has this great backfield hybrid movement. New York on offense has this fantastic group of cutters who I just don't think Carolina has a matchup for everybody there. Maybe they'll need to play some Henry Fisher or some Jacob Fairfax on defense to try to slow down your, Jeff Babbitt's and your Ryan Osgars of the world. Same thing with, who does New York put out there as handler defenders? It'll be interesting to see. But what's your first take on this New York Carolina rematch?
So many great storylines. Jack and Oscar, who play in the ring system and club, in the Raleigh system, now going against their Carolina teammates for year 2. New York just wanting to avenge their last year's championship loss. Carolina wanting to retain it. And the big ball versus the small ball. And I think that's a little reductive because there is Henry Fisher, there is Jacob Fairfax, and Eric Taylor can sling it as good as anybody. On Carolina, on the other side, we saw a lot of small ball from New York against DC, which was Jack, Oscar, Saul Rushmeyer-Bailey, Elliot Shartok moving the disc around a lot. Charles Weinberg will sometimes get in there. And so, yeah, it's really going to be important to see who gets off to the fast start, because there's a lot of confidence to come in your offense. And I wonder just how this game goes for both teams and what it looks like, which I feel like for Carolina, they make it a struggle for New York to score fast. And it feels like they're going to be successful in some part of doing that. And then for New York, I was thinking about it and going, okay, you're looking at the worst case scenario, what you saw against DC. The problem last year was they could keep pace offensively with a unit that was relatively not as good. But defensively, they couldn't get turnovers and couldn't punch in breaks. Well, do you really believe in you adding to the D-line in terms of John Randolph and Jabron Meeser that you're going to have trouble getting more turnovers?
Yeah, don't forget about Antoine Davis. He's there too.
Exactly right.
I think the New York defense certainly has improved this year. It'll be interesting to me, though, if the players they added are the right matchups to actually slow down Carolina, or if they're just more talented versions of players who aren't going to quite get it done.
Exactly right. I think looking at, they have matchups for Fisher, I think. Do they have a matchup for Durs? They can move someone there probably, but at what cost?
I mean, Durs 2.0 is John Randolph, at least the offensive version. So it'd be interesting.
So you're telling me you're predicting a John Randolph versus Durs matchup?
I think that makes the most sense. Yeah, I mean, well, usually in these kind of games, right, you don't have like one set matchup for a person. You kind of rotate through them, give them a few different looks, tire out the one offensive player compared to 2 or 3 defensive players who take turns. So I don't think it'll be like every point back and forth kind of thing. But yeah, if I was looking at New York's roster, I think he's probably the best suited for that matchup.
He might very well be, but it takes it away from someone else. So it's just a question of where do you put your strengths and what do you do in the other places where you feel like you can win or not. And that's always a tough battle. Like going in as a coach, it's one of those things when you guard really good players, there are just some cases where, you know what, you go, I could put my best defender here, but I could also move them somewhere else where they're going to get blocks and make more of an impact. And then it's like, who's the lesser defender I can put on to someone to just do a good job and just do their job well. And over the years, we've had players that have done that when I've been coaching, which is they're not necessarily the best defender, but they're the most disciplined defender you can get. And so, is that someone you can put on Durs? I don't know. Is that someone you can put on Gooch? I don't know. You're going to have to find a place. It's different than hiding someone, but usually, I've loved to do this with people who have really big wingspans who can play disciplined to guard throwers. At the least, if we need to hide or plug a hole, you're going to get a good mark, and it's going to influence things in a certain way. Durs is different than that because he's so specialized and he's so good. I don't think you can just put a big guy on him and live with it, but it's going to be kind of the test. If New York can get turns early and get Carolina to, I don't know if you want Carolina shooting on the big field in this way or what you want, but the one thing I think would be bad to see is if New York's giving up easy resets. I think that's going to make Saul and Gooch's job really easy over and over again. And so that's a question of how do they handle that? What do they do going forward with it? And I expect to see a variety of game plans there.
Yeah, that's, Carolina's entire offense is pretty much predicated on the fact that Saul and Matt Kuchahanis and Andrew Youngs can just keep the ball moving between them until something else opens up. And if New York is forcing them to go deep or to take shots, you have your Henry Fishers and your Jacob Fairfax and Alex Davis now on offense who can make the kind of plays needed to complete those kind of shots. But yeah, I think New York will probably think it has better matchups downfield than in the backfield for sure.
Yeah, the other side of it is how do you get the size on New York's O-line, and what do you do with Jack Williams and Ryan Oscar? And it kind of goes the same thing. It's who do you use to guard Jack Williams? Well, Carolina's kind of interesting here because it seems like they've had people in the past like Tim McAllister do it because they have that experience, so they know exactly what they want. I think in other teams, you might have to consider the fact that Jack's going to be Jack, and there's not much you can do about it. And I think Jack's going to be a special player this game. I can't imagine he wants to lose to Carolina
again.
But then the other side of it, who guards Jeff Babbitt? That's another matchup where it's you're not winning that matchup. You're just not.
No, that one would be interesting to me if you see Fairfax cross over to defense. I think he's probably on paper the best matchup. Or whether you stick a smart defender like an Eric Taylor on him and hope to limit the impact.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. In a lot of ways, it's really interesting because Carolina is this young team. Long term, if you think about where they're going to be 5 years from now, this core is going to last a long time, right? They're young. They're going to be all active. This core for New York is older. 5 years from now, you could see a lot of them retired. You could see a lot of them, still playing, but not to what they once were potentially. So I think this is a big legacy game. We don't have a Hall of Fame yet in the AUDL, but who wins this game is going to have bragging rights for the rest of their lives. And New York doesn't have that many times left to do this with the current players that they have. So I think this is a legacy game for a lot of people on New York side. It's going to be interesting to see what type of pressure they feel going into it and how much hunger they display, because this is it. This is what you came for. Beat Carolina.
Yeah, and on the Carolina side, it's a pride game, right? We did this last year. We got to make sure we're still up to par and can do it again. A lot of the Carolina players are just lost to a lot of the New York players in the World Club Championships. They might play each other again, literally a week after this tournament at the US Ultimate Pro Champs. So a lot of interesting, intertwining narratives there, especially given that Williams and Osgar play club with the folks from Raleigh. So lots to look forward to. I think for almost everybody watching this weekend, this is the game. This is honestly the de facto championship game. I think either Carolina or New York will be favored against Chicago or Colorado. Lots to look for. It is the Friday night game, primetime viewing on AUDL TV. So make sure you watch that. Any last thoughts about this before we move to the other half of the bracket?
I think it's gonna be a great game. Tune in, you get to hear my voice, or mute it and you don't. So
no, you highly recommended you can tune in. All right, we're going to take a quick break here. When we come back, we'll be talking Colorado and Chicago. Lots of intriguing storylines in that one, too. And one of those teams will be facing off against either Carolina or New York for the AUDL Championship in just a few days. Stick around. We'll be right back. All right, everyone, welcome back to Stall 7. Alex here alongside Bryan. And we're just going to dive right into the West Coast Championship. We had Salt Lake traveling to Colorado. In a game, Colorado ends up winning 26-21. This game is much closer than it appears. Colorado jumped out to a big 6-2 lead. By halftime, it was 12-12. Salt Lake did a great job coming back. And just in the fourth quarter, it was tied up at 18. And then suddenly it was 22-18 as Colorado really pulled away. Specifically want to highlight the play of Matt Jackson leading Colorado, both as like a calm, emotional leader. But he had this massive block early in the third quarter, I believe it was. Maybe late in the third quarter. I think that stopped what would have been a Salt Lake break chance that would have put them ahead for the first time in the game. Just a filthy sky on a helixing disc. And I think that sort of galvanized the Colorado team. But good showing from Salt Lake. They played their game just like we thought they would, going back and forth, making it a little bit ugly. The Salt Lake shout out definitely has to go to Joel Clutton, who, as the Shred offense was faltering, he really stepped up into a big time cutter role and played a nearly flawless game. Let me pull up.
He was fantastic.
Yeah. 4 goals, 2 assists, no turnovers, 360 total yards, 318 of that was receiving. Played a lot of points, 19 on offense, 9 on defense, and that adjustment, moving him to the offense, saved the game, I think, for Salt Lake. I mean, saved it as much as they ended up losing by 5, but had it tied through 3 quarters.
And then the other side, Minnesota-Chicago, Chicago ended up winning that game. Chicago basically has a performance that the scoreline, indicates that at points it was closer than it was, but Chicago had a mound of break chances. I believe 13 in the first half that they basically were not punching in because they were just trying to huck it and score very quickly. But it didn't really look like Minnesota really put up much of a threat. They got close a little bit in the second half, and then from there it was just Chicago's offense looked stellar. They have this really young core of group of guys with Pavel and Kyle Rutledge and Jeff Weiss and Jack Shanahan and Paul Arders, et cetera, that just moved the disc really well and were able to navigate the winds of that stadium. And defensively, they were able to come up with timely blocks. They were able to come up with a lot of good defensive pressure that just didn't lead to a lot of breaks. This game, it's one of those things where it was closer at points than the scoreline indicates, but it could have been a lot worse. Like Chicago could have blown the doors off of this thing if they had played the way they were capable of going in with their defense once they got the turns. But nonetheless, here they are at championship weekend facing off against Colorado.
Yeah, no, I think, Chicago definitely has to feel like they should have blown this game open a lot earlier than they did. Part of that, I think, is the effect of they had a bunch of players who were playing all together, maybe for the first time. And that's, basically the D-line offense, right? You're Dalton Smith, Tim Schock, Joe White. And you got a pretty classic Joe White game, I feel like, here. Right? You have 4 assists, a goal, 361 total yards of offense, and 4 turnovers. And I think he's always going to be an X factor in any game he plays. I like this role for him as like the D-line quarterback, crosses over to offense if needed, or plays offense after a timeout. And his talent is just so obvious. But I think also part of the reason why, Chicago kept throwing up windhucks and not converting them.
Yeah, super talented guy. Well, let's look forward because, Joe White is going to be an impact player, I think, going forward into this game. Just to say, we talked about Carolina versus New York, but these two teams each have 1 loss. And for the first time at championship weekend, I don't think there's any scrubs here at all. Not whatsoever. I think any of these teams could win a championship. I think I rate Colorado's chances a little bit lower, but this is a good team with Nethercutt, a young guy in Danny Landisman, Jay Frood with experience. You talked about Matt Jackson. On the other side, Chicago, really good offense. I talked about some of their players earlier. And both of them have good defenses. They can punch. I think this could be a great game in itself, too.
Oh, it's going to be a fantastic game. Has the underlying story, Pavel Giannis, the Chicago captain, leader, wears his crown during press conferences. He grew up in Colorado. He was actually at Colorado Summit tryouts just because he happened to be, in the area at the time they were happening. But a nice little connection there also for Pavel. Pavel also broke the AUDL all-time assists record in the last game. He now has 391 assists.
I did text him about that. And he did tell me it's whatever. So that tells you how much he gives a hoot about that going into championship weekend.
He does, honestly, his post-game interview afterwards, like, yeah, this is great, but also we won the game. We're going to championship weekend, and that was our goal. It was also interesting actually watching the interview after the game. The person asking the questions was like talking about, hopes are winning a championship. And Paul was like, yeah, there's a lot of really good teams coming. So I think the players know that they're in for some tough games. But also I think, put it this way, it's a little sneak preview here, all right, depending on when this come out. I think every single person in the Ulti World AUDL chat picked Chicago to win this game.
It's a good pick. That's not to hide my picks, I guess. But that's who I have winning this game.
Yeah, I think it probably will be for me too. I think what impressed me the most with this game was that even the mistakes that Chicago made against Minnesota, it felt like they cleaned them up. Whether that was Jeff Weiss bailing them out with a ridiculous catch, or whether that was calling a timeout at the right time and then refocusing. I think this Chicago team, now that they're all together, has a pretty good focus, and remembers that this time last year they were a minute and a half away from beating Raleigh in the semifinals. Like this team knows it can play.
They can, yeah, and they have that experience, and that's always interesting going in, is having that championship weekend experience. And Chicago, a lot of these players have played in big games. I don't think anybody's afraid of the lights going into this whatsoever. So they could be the more veteran savvy team, the more experienced team. Colorado, on the other side of it, they have a ton of players with experience. Jay Frew, Jonathan Nethercutt, Matt Jackson. Is this team going to be nervous going into it? Maybe.
I'm curious about that. I'm curious, maybe from your experience, how much does having a player like Nutt, who was at this tournament last year, someone like Matt Jackson, who's won an AUDL championship, or someone like Jay Fruit or Dave Wiseman, who've played at Bree Stevens before, how much does that matter to a team like Colorado?
I think you got to make it fun. I think having gone through that process recently over the last few years, there's something to it where you can recognize how cool the moment is for a little bit, but then the ability to just focus on business is important. And that's like such a weird thing to say, because on one hand, I'm talking about having fun. On the other hand, I'm talking about business. And there's this kind of sweet spot that I felt on the teams I've been a part of that are like very loose in warm-ups, having a ton of fun, but they're still like doing it in a way where they're focused on hitting their marks and getting ready for the game and getting themselves to 100%. And so I think it matters a lot. I think Nethercutt, especially having been around him and been fortunate and to learn from him, is he has this way about him that is locked in, but extremely fun. Extremely fun. He's one of the best people to be around in the business. And so when you have that saturation of group of people that have been there that say, hey, here's what to expect. You're going to get to the fields. It's going to be really cool. We're going to take a few minutes. We're going to get there maybe a little earlier than we normally would to just take it all in. And then from there, we're going to have a blast. This is the culmination of our season regardless. And let's go out there and do it. And I think I've seen teams do it the wrong way, where they say, we're going to win a championship. And everybody's like gung-ho and frothing at the mouth, being like, we're here, we're so confident. And there's almost a level of arrogance and overconfidence that comes with it. Whereas I see the teams that come in is they block out the noise. Carolina does this. I think New York does this. They are who they are. They're not changing their behavior. They're not trying to talk to the media and saying how good they are. They're just confident, having fun, and making it about themselves. And that can be challenging if it's your first time in a big stage, is all these thoughts about like what happens if I blow it. I'm sure enters every athlete's mind at some point in time. But it's more important to have a really good team in a team building process. Whenever we talk about having team building and a tight-knit team, it's for these moments when you're going to face adversity and you have to come together where this entire moment could be turning against you, where you can kind of feel the stadium gets, the air gets sucked out of it if you make a bad play. And it's all about each other picking each other up in those moments. So I think it's extremely important for Colorado, especially this young team.
Yeah, really, really interesting, especially like it's championship weekend. It's the mystique of Breese Stevens Field and the capital city of Ultimate. We're just in for a really excited weekend. I'm really excited. Bryan, you'll be there. I'll be there also reporting for Ulti World. Before we get into our picks in just a minute, what's like, maybe even aside from the games themselves, what's the thing that you're looking forward to the most about this weekend?
I think we're dealing with a lot of high IQ defenses. When I watch Colorado, one of the things I heard through the course of the season was they mark in a different way, and they have not just a strict force. So I'm looking forward to seeing them run that a little bit more. I've been kind of keeping an eye on it. And a lot of young players off of that team. Matthew Agee, he's made some incredible plays. Tatum has been really good for them from a depth perspective. And so the young players of Colorado are really exciting. I'm curious to see how Pavel's going to do. He has been this motor. He's been this machine. Can he continue to do that against the best defenses? I don't know that the Central has given him all that he's going to face this weekend and will be an adjustment. For Carolina, they have a way of doing things, and it's kind of like if you win, it's another stamp of approval on the way North Carolina has been running the sport for a while. And then for New York, I think it's just those superstars. Can you build a team, from the top down in a way where you have just the most talent and bring it together? That's a challenge in and of itself. I think these are going to be some incredible games.
Absolutely. And I'll say just this is, as the marquee AUDL event of the year, to me, it's also just really fun, being there in person and seeing, even the whether it's players or owners or coaches, like people from teams that aren't playing here, all together and interacting and really enjoying the festivities. This will be my first time at Breese Stevens also, so I'm excited to, see the venue and feel the vibes. I've heard such good things. So all in all, going to be a really exciting weekend. Before we close out this episode, I think we have to make some picks.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think I'm going to go first on this one because it's easy. There's no way I'm picking against New York. I'm going to take New York over Carolina to make it over to the championship game.
Great. So I believe the spread is New York -2. Do you take them with the 2 points or just straight up?
I think I got to take Carolina. I think it's going to be a great game.
Amazing. I'm going to pick Carolina here
to win and cover.
Oh yeah. If they win, they cover because they have positive points here. I don't know what it is about this team that I think more than anyone else, feels like they could not play a perfect game and still come away all right with it. And I also think that they'll be able to watch the footage from DC last week and take what the Breeze did and make life so hard for this New York team. I think New York's under a lot of pressure. Carolina too, everyone. These are, the most important games of the season. It would not surprise me if New York has another less than perfect game, especially with the quick turnaround between games, playing these games on a Friday night. I don't know that I have much more, straight up analysis in that, other than Carolina is the most deepest versatile team. I think New York's top 7 can play anywhere with anyone, but I think Carolina's top 20 can do that. And maybe I just want to be different than literally everyone else who's picking New York. But
you didn't pick them to win to start the season. You had DC, so you're sticking with it.
Came really close to coming true last week.
That's right. You would have looked great.
Let's go to the other game. I think you had mentioned Chicago and Colorado right now are just a straight pick 'em. So who do you have in that game?
I'm going to take Chicago, but I think it's like a 55-60% chance of winning. I'm not going to be surprised at all if Colorado pulls this one out. They've got a great team.
Yeah, I think just experience is going to win in this one. Also, we saw it last year. San Diego looked like they could maybe put a scare in New York and didn't even come close. I think Colorado needs to be there for a year before they can really threaten. So I'll take Chicago. And I imagine that we unfortunately both have the Chicago Union losing to either New York or Carolina in the final. But I'll just check to make sure.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Well, we might have to do an emergency pod if all of a sudden we're looking at Colorado versus Carolina or something and we have to check in. But I think the winner of this Carolina-New York semifinal is going to be the eventual AUDL champion.
I agree with that. But, that's why they play the games, just in case something interesting happens. So very much looking forward to it. Like we said, lots of excitement still to come. We look forward to talking to you and maybe next week if we need an emergency pod in the middle of championship weekend, but certainly if not then afterwards. Feel free to get in touch with us at Stall7 on Twitter, or you can find either me or Bryan if you're an Ultiworld subscriber or in the Ultiworld Discord. We really love interacting with our listeners. Feel free to drop us a line. And if you're going to be at Championship Weekend, both Bryan and I will be there. Please come say hi. Like I said, really love interacting with everyone out there. But that's all we got for this week. Make sure to tune in live on AUDL TV for Friday night's game, Fox Sports 2 for Saturday night's game, or in person at Bree Stevens Field in Madison, Wisconsin. We are really looking forward to a great weekend. And I think that's it for now. We'll talk to you again soon.